The journey to Valhalla, that golden hall of the slain presided over by the god Odin, did not begin with a sword stroke in battle, but with stillness. It began here, on the damp earth of a Scandinavian farmstead in the late 9th century, with the body of a man who had lived as a warrior, a farmer, and a chieftain. His final voyage, a meticulously orchestrated ritual of smoke, sacrifice, and symbolic passage, was not mere disposal of the dead. It was a critical, perilous operation to transport a soul from the realm of the living to the realm of the eternal, a process so vital that its correct execution was believed to safeguard the fortunes of the entire community. To understand the brutality and beauty of a Viking funeral is to peer into the very core of their worldview, where the boundaries between life and death, human and animal, chieftain and god, were not solid walls but permeable mists. It was a world where honor was currency, memory was immortality, and a funeral pyre's blaze was both a beacon for the departing and a warning to the living of the fragility of their own existence. The man we will follow was not a legendary king from the sagas, but a man of substance, buried with the rites of the old religion in a time when the new god, Christ, was beginning to whisper from the south. His death created a vacuum, a silence where once there was a commanding voice, and into that silence rushed a cacophony of ritual, each act designed to manage the dangerous power of the dead, to celebrate a life, and to secure a legacy. The first days were a period of tense preparation, a liminal time where the deceased, though physically present, was socially absent and spiritually in transit. The body would have been carefully washed and dressed in his finest clothes, not of everyday wool but perhaps of fine linen or even silk, acquired through trade or raid, fabrics that spoke of distant lands and wide-ranging influence. His weapons were placed beside him, a sword with a patterned blade, its hilt worn smooth from a lifetime's grip, a spear whose ash shaft was notched from parries, a round shield, its paint chipped and its leather covering scarred. These were not mere grave goods, but essential components of his identity, tools he would need in the afterlife. The concept of the social persona in death, as discussed in the context of mortuary archaeology, is vividly illustrated here. The objects chosen for burial were a deliberate curation, a final public statement of who this man was, or more precisely, who his family and community needed him to be in death: the warrior, the provider, the leader. This careful dressing and provisioning was the first step in constructing the vessel for his journey, a vessel made not of wood but of memory and status. Around the body, the household moved with a purpose that masked a deep undercurrent of anxiety. A great feast was being planned, a funeral ale that would serve multiple crucial functions. It was a gathering of the clan, a reaffirmation of bonds strained by loss. It was a forum for the recitation of poetry, where scalids would weave complex verses detailing the man's lineage, his exploits in battle, his generosity in hall. This poetic memorialization was the software uploaded to the hardware of the grave goods. It gave meaning to the sword, context to the scars, and eternity to a name that might otherwise fade. But this feast was also a moment of extreme political danger. With the central authority figure gone, the question of succession hung in the air, as tangible as the smell of brewing beer. Rivals within the family or from neighboring districts might see this moment of vulnerability as an opportunity. The funeral, therefore, had to be a display of unity and strength so potent that it would deter any thoughts of challenge. The vast quantities of food and drink consumed, the very extravagance of the rite, were a demonstration of the family's remaining wealth and cohesion, a performance of power for an audience of both the living and the unseen. The body, lying in state, was the silent center of this whirlwind of activity, a stark reminder of what had been lost and what now had to be defended. The location for the final act was chosen with care. It was often a prominent place, a high riverbank or a headland visible from the sea, a place where the pyre or the burial mound would become a permanent feature of the landscape, a stone bookmark in the family's claim to the land. The choice between cremation and inhumation varied across time and region, influenced by fashion, contacts with other cultures, and perhaps deeper shifts in religious belief. Cremation, with its transformative fire, held a potent symbolism. It rapidly dissolved the physical vessel, releasing the spirit, and the rising smoke could be seen as a direct ascent or journey. Inhumation, particularly within a ship or boat, emphasized a different metaphor, a contained voyage to the afterlife. For our chieftain, let us imagine the more dramatic and archaeologically attested ship burial, a spectacle that consumed resources on a staggering scale. A serviceable vessel, perhaps the very ship that had carried him on trading voyages to the Baltic or raiding expeditions to the shores of Francia, was hauled from the water. Its mast was struck, and it was dragged inland, a laborious process requiring the coordinated muscle of every able-bodied person in the district. This act alone was a statement. We are turning a tool of motion and life into a chamber of stillness and death. The ship was placed in a trench dug to receive its hull, its prow pointing towards the sea or perhaps towards the mythical realm of the dead, becoming a static arc on the edge of two worlds. As the ship settled into its earthy berth, the process of loading this vessel for its final voyage began. The chieftain's body was carried from the hall and placed amidships on a bed prepared within a small timber chamber or under a canopy of cloth. He was surrounded by the artifacts of his life and status, his weapons certainly, but also more intimate possessions. There might be a set of finely carved gaming pieces and a board for Heinz Nifatavel, the strategic wargame of the North, speaking to a mind that prized cunning as well as courage. There would be tools for feasting, drinking horns rimmed with silver, a cauldron for cooking, perhaps a fine glass beaker from the Rhineland, a souvenir from a journey far beyond the fjords. Containers of food and drink were placed alongside him, barley beer, smoked mutton, dried fish provisions for the journey ahead. This was not a literal belief that he would consume them, but a symbolic act of provisioning, an assurance that he would not want in the next world. Every object was a word in the story being told about him, a story crafted not for history books, but for the gods and the ancestors who would receive him. The care taken in this arrangement reflects a profound need to maintain the social order even in death. By equipping him fully, the community was affirming that his status was not erased by mortality, but would continue in the halls of the afterlife, thereby preserving the cosmic structure they depended upon. Yet the most potent and troubling aspect of this cargo, from a modern perspective, was the inclusion of living beings. The descriptions of ship burials in sagas and, more crucially, the chilling archaeological evidence from sites like the Oseberg ship in Norway point to the sacrifice of animals as a central component of the rite. For a chieftain of high standing, this would not be limited to a single hound or hawk, though these loyal companions might be included. The sacrifice of large livestock, particularly horses and oxen, was a staggering economic sacrifice, a deliberate destruction of vital capital. These animals were slaughtered, their bodies arranged in the burial, often with a stark, geometric precision that belies any notion of simple disposal. They were placed in groups, their heads sometimes oriented in a specific direction. This was not random violence, but a highly structured offering. The animals served multiple symbolic purposes. They were sustenance for the afterlife, a display of the family's wealth and willingness to spend it for honor, and perhaps most importantly, they were a retinue for the deceased. Just as a living chieftain needed his entourage, so too would his spirit require a following, a show of force and prestige as he entered the company of the gods. The killing of these powerful creatures, the very basis of agricultural and martial power, and their consignment to the earth, was a transaction of immense gravity, an exchange of tangible, worldly wealth for intangible, otherworldly credit. The historical and archaeological record becomes most haunting, however, when it touches upon the possibility of human sacrifice. The 10th century Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, in his detailed eyewitness account of a Rus's funeral on the Volga River, describes the voluntary death of a slave girl who accompanied her master into the afterlife. While the Russes were a mix of Norse and Slavic peoples, their rituals shared deep roots with the Scandinavian world. His testimony is graphic and unsettling. The girl is treated with ritualized reverence, given intoxicating drinks, and then ritually killed by an elderly woman known as the Angel of Death before being placed alongside her master on the ship. In Scandinavia itself, forensic archaeology at sites like the Viking Age burial ground at Birka in Sweden reveals anomalies, bodies in graves that appear to be in unnatural positions, or individuals buried without grave goods, in positions of subservience to a primary interment. These are not definitive proof of widespread human sacrifice, but they are strong indicators that the practice existed in certain contexts, particularly for high-status burials. For our chieftain's funeral, the question hangs in the air like wood smoke. Would his passage require a human attendant? The decision would be one of extreme gravity, balancing spiritual belief against the value of a human life. the desire to honor the dead with the need to maintain the labor force of the living. If it occurred, it would be the darkest stroke in this elaborate portrait, a brutal affirmation that the chieftain's power extended beyond the grave, capable of drawing others into his final, silent journey. The culmination of all this preparation was the moment of sealing and consecration. Once the body, the goods, the animals, and any other offerings were positioned within the ship, the ceremony reached its peak. In a cremation, torches would be applied to the pyre, the flames hungrily consuming the timber and the offerings within, creating a blaze visible for miles. In an inhumation, like the one we are envisioning, the act of covering the ship was the symbolic act of launch. The community would take up shovels and begin to pile earth over the vessel, first as a gentle rain of soil, then as heavy clods, until the elegant lines of the hull disappeared under a growing mound. As the soil fell, prayers and invocations would be spoken, not to a benevolent god of love, but to Odin the All-Father, the god of the slain, or to Frey, the god of earthly prosperity. They might call upon the Dizir, the female guardian spirits of the family, to guide their kinsmen safely. This was not a quiet, mournful interment, but a loud, public, and participatory act. The mound's creation was the final, physical statement. It was a landmark that would dominate the landscape for centuries, a permanent reminder of the man buried beneath and the family that remained. It was a territorial marker, a claim of ownership written in turf and stone, and it was a bridge, a man-made hill that connected the world of the living, bustling on its surface, with the world of the dead, silent and provisioned within. The chieftain was now gone, but his presence was permanently etched into the very fabric of the land. With the final clod of earth placed and the mound shaped into a permanent, grassy dome, the living's immediate ritual duty was complete. But the psychological and social journey of the funeral was far from over. The funeral feast, the shorn or ale of inheritance, now commenced in earnest, and its functions were as complex and critical as the burial itself. This was not a somber wake, but a roaring, days-long assertion of life in the face of death. Vast quantities of the finest food and drink the household could muster were consumed, a deliberate and conspicuous expenditure that served as the economic engine of the funeral's political message. The meat from sacrificed animals not interred in the grave would be roasted and shared. Barrels of ale and mead, brewed specifically for this occasion, would be tapped. To eat and drink lavishly at a funeral was an act of communion with the deceased, a sharing of his wealth one final time. But it was also a potent display of the inheritor's strength. The new head of the family, often the eldest son, was the host, and his ability to provision such a feast directly demonstrated his capacity to steward the family's resources. He was, in effect, using the dead man's wealth to cement his own authority, a transfer of symbolic capital as important as the transfer of land and title. Within this cacophony of consumption, the art of memory was forged. The skalds held a place of honor. Their poems, composed in intricate meters and laced with metaphorical language known as kennings, did not merely list deeds. They transmuted raw action into mythic narrative. A battle became the Storm of Odin. A generous lord was the scatterer of ringstones. Through this art, the deceased was lifted from the realm of personal recollection into the realm of legend, his life woven into the larger tapestry of ancestral heroism. This poetic memorialization was a form of social immortality. As long as the poem was recited, the man lived in the voices of the living. The funeral feast was the launch platform for this immortality project. The stories told, the boasts confirmed, the grievances settled over drinking horns, all were part of curating the chieftain's eternal reputation. It was also a moment of legal and social reckoning. Debts might be forgiven in his name, or outstanding disputes formally settled as a tribute to his memory. The community was not just mourning a loss, it was actively rebuilding its social fabric around the void his death had created, using ritual, poetry, and lore as their threads. The afterlife destination was not a single, uniform paradise. The Viking Age mind envisioned a segmented hereafter, and the funeral rites were, in part, an attempt to steer the soul to its desired end. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was the most famous, but it was reserved for those chosen by Odin, typically warriors who died blade in hand. For our chieftain, a man who had lived by the sword, this was a likely and desired destination. The inclusion of his weapons, the recitation of his battles, and the very manner of his burial were applications for admission to that golden hall. Yet there was also Freya's field, Folkvanga, where she claimed half the slain. For a seafarer, the idea of Rand's Hall at the bottom of the ocean, where she netted the drowned, was a potent reality. And for many, perhaps the majority, the afterlife was a shadowy continuation of life within the burial mound itself. The mound was not just a grave, it was a hauger, a potentially animate home of the deceased, who could become a draugr, a mound dweller, if not properly appeased or if buried with unresolved rage. The grave goods then were also provisions for this more localized afterlife. The funeral rituals served to gently but firmly encourage the spirit to depart for a distant, glorious realm like Valhalla, rather than linger uncomfortably close to home as a potentially restless and dangerous ancestor. The feast, the songs, the finality of the burial, all were signals to the soul that its ties to the community of the living were being ceremoniously, respectfully, but definitively cut. The legacy of the funeral mound extended far beyond the generation that built it. It became an anchor point for identity and a node in the cultural landscape. As decades and centuries passed, the mound, now weathered and covered in grass, remained. It was a physical testament to a family's ancient right to the land, a silent but unchallengeable deed of ownership. Later generations would point to it as the burial place of our forefather, a tangible link to a heroic, semi-mythical past. This connection is powerfully illustrated by the runestones raised in the 10th and 11th centuries, often placed near roads or burial sites. Many carry inscriptions that do more than just name the dead, they actively curate memory and issue social challenges. A stone might state, X raised this stone in memory of Y, his father, a very good Then, but equally it might add, Z carved these runes in memory of his brother, but Sigvid was the killer. The funeral was the initial act of memory making, but the stone was its permanent public archive. The mound and the runestone worked in concert, one a silent earthen presence, the other a vocal textual proclamation. Together, they wove the deceased into the enduring story of the place, ensuring that the journey to the afterlife was mirrored by a parallel journey into the realm of collective ancestry, where the dead continued to exert influence over the living through the power of claimed history and inherited honor. Yet this entire elaborate system of belief and practice existed within a world in ferment. Even as our chieftain was laid to rest with full pagan rites in the late 9th century, the first whispers of a new religious order were penetrating the Norse world. Christian missionaries from Hamburg, Bremen and England were making inroads not through mass conversion but through strategic alliances with local rulers. The new faith offered a different eschatology, a single heaven and hell, a rejection of lavish grave goods as pagan vanity, and a focus on the soul's salvation rather than the corporeal provisioning of the dead. Initially, the two systems clashed and coexisted, sometimes in startlingly direct ways. There are graves from this transition period that contain both Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses. A chieftain might be buried in a mound in the old style, but his son, seeking trade advantages or political alliance with Christian kings, might be buried in a churchyard. The ship burial, as a spectacular, resource-intensive, and ideologically pagan practice, stood in direct opposition to the Christian ethos of humility and spiritual transcendence. Its gradual disappearance over the 10th and 11th centuries is a map of the changing Norse soul. The final journeys to Valhalla were, therefore, not just ends of individual lives, but also the end of an era. Each blazing pyre, each buried ship, was a defiant, beautiful, and brutal reaffirmation of a worldview that was, itself, sailing into the twilight. The profound transformation of funerary practice from the pagan ship burial to Christian churchyard inhumation was not a swift, clean replacement but a centuries-long negotiation, a cultural osmosis where old instincts cloaked themselves in new forms. The desire to mark status and memory in death proved more durable than the specific rituals of the old gods. Even as the cross replaced the hammer, the Norse aristocracy found ways to express their lineage and power through mortuary display. One of the most telling transitional forms is the use of stone-lined burial chambers, or cist graves, often placed prominently within early churchyards. These were not simple pits in the earth. They were carefully constructed mini-chambers, sometimes even roofed with timber, echoing the timber chambers within the pagan ship burials. The body might be laid to rest with a crucifix, but also with an heirloom sword deliberately bent or killed to render it useless for the living, a pagan practice persisting in a Christian context. This indicates that the deep-seated need to equip the dead to send a part of the family's worldly power with them did not vanish with baptism. It merely adapted, finding a new symbolic language. The funeral feast itself, the Shond, evolved into the Christian charity feast for the soul, but its core social functions, the gathering of the kin, the display of the heir's generosity, the reaffirmation of community remained utterly intact. The vessel for the journey had changed, but the passengers, the memory, the status, the familial obligations were the same. This transition can be traced archaeologically in the shifting grave goods, the lavish sets of weapons, tools, and feasting gear that characterize the 9th and early 10th century burials gradually diminish. However, they are often replaced by items of personal adornment and dress that speak just as loudly of wealth and connection. Elaborate brooches, beads of imported glass and stone, and finely woven textiles become the primary media for status display. A woman's grave from late 10th century Denmark might contain no obvious pagan symbols, but the style and quantity of her oval brooches and the silver thread in her headdress would communicate her family's rank and trade networks just as effectively as a chest of weapons. The focus shifted from provisioning for an active afterlife to presenting a perfected, static image of the deceased in their social prime, a concept more aligned with Christian burial awaiting resurrection. Yet, the underlying impulse to use the body as a canvas upon which to paint a statement of identity for the living community to see was a direct inheritance from the pagan past. The funeral remained a political stage, only the props and the script had been subtly revised. The most significant and enduring legacy of the Viking Age funeral, however, lies not in the artifacts left behind, but in the conceptual landscape it shaped. The pagan Norse worldview did not separate the living and the dead into strictly demarcated realms. The burial mound was a physical point of contact, a place where the veil was thin. Ancestors could be beneficent sources of luck and protection, or, if wronged, dangerous haunters of the living. This produced a landscape thick with memory and agency, where certain hills, stones, and waterways were understood to be inhabited by presences from the past. With the arrival of Christianity, the church sought to exorcise this landscape by building churches on top of pagan burial sites or declaring them unholy, but the stories persisted, morphing into folklore. The Droga, the animated corpse of the old mound dweller, found new life in tales of churchyard ghosts. The helpful ancestor became the guardian spirit of the farm. The physicality of the pagan funeral, its insistence on marking the land permanently created anchor points for memory that resisted total erasure. The modern Scandinavian landscape, dotted with thousands of these ancient mounds, is a testament to this. They are now protected historical monuments, but for centuries they were known features with local names, often associated with tales of hidden treasure or supernatural guardians, a folk memory echoing the original, potent belief that something of consequence still resided within. To return to our chieftain then, lying in his ship under the newly raised mound, is to understand that his funeral was not an end but a translation. His physical journey was over, but his social journey was accelerating. He had been transformed from a living man into an ancestor, a legal entity, a mythic figure, and a territorial claim. The immense labor, the sacrificed wealth, the ritualized violence, all of it was an investment in this translation process. It was a societal mechanism to manage the profound disruption of death, to convert the raw, terrifying fact of mortality into a structured, culturally useful narrative of continuity. The brutality of animal sacrifice and the potential for human accompaniment shock the modern sensibility because they lay bare the stark calculus of this ancient world. That communal stability and honor could be worth more than individual life, that the voyage of a single soul to the gods required the concerted energy and sacrifice of the entire community. It was a system devoid of sentimentality, yet brimming with a profound sense of duty, obligation, and love, a love expressed not through gentle mourning, but through the lavish, destructive, and enduring act of remembrance. The final truth of the Viking funeral, therefore, is that it was never solely for the dead. It was a mirror held up to the living, reflecting their deepest values, their fears, and their aspirations. In the roaring flames of the pyre or the silent darkness of the ship burial, they saw their own fragility and their own potential for glory. By sending their leader off with such overwhelming spectacle, they were making a statement about their own strength, cohesion, and resilience. they were defining themselves in the face of loss. The journey to Valhalla was a communal performance of identity, a ritual so potent that its echoes shaped the transition to a new world and still resonate in the stories and landscapes of the North today. The chieftain's voyage was complete, but the voyage of his memory, launched with such deliberate and brutal ceremony, had only just begun its long sail through time. Thus, the image of the Viking funeral as a mere spectacle of destruction is a profound simplification. It was, in its essence, a complex technology of transition. Every element, from the positioning of the horse's skull to the cadence of the skald's verse, served a purpose in an intricate sociological and spiritual operation. The community was not just burying a body, it was carefully decommissioning a social role, redistributing authority, re-establishing cosmic order, and launching a curated memory into the stream of time. The sheer material cost the ship removed from commerce, the weapons taken from defense, the livestock destroyed, was a deliberate and staggering investment in social and spiritual capital. This was an economy of eternity, where present wealth was sacrificed for future stability, both in the afterlife and for the generations to come on the family farm. The mound was the bank where this capital was deposited, a growing hill of earth and legacy that promised dividends of honor and claim. In the stillness that followed the feast, with the mound a dark silhouette against the northern sky, the world felt different. A pillar of the community had become a part of the landscape. His heirs now bore the weight of his name and the responsibility for his legend. The objects of daily life, a chair he sat in, a path he walked, held a new, poignant emptiness. Yet, because of the funeral's exhaustive ritual, that emptiness was not a void of chaos but a defined space. It was a space now filled with a story, with lawfully transferred authority, and with a tangible, visitable monument. The grief was real and personal, but it had been channeled, through ritual, into productive and stabilizing forms. The dangerous, polluting power of death had been contained and converted into a source of ancestral strength. The chieftain was gone, but the chieftainship remained. His individual voice was silent, but the chorus of his lineage, fortified by the epic of his funeral, sang on. The long history of archaeology, from the plundering of kings in the Renaissance to the meticulous modern excavations at sites like Ladby in Denmark or Valsgärde in Sweden, represents a later chapter in this story of memory. When we open a burial mound today, we are not merely uncovering artifacts. We are intercepting a conversation that was meant to last forever. We are reading the last will and testament of a culture, written in soil, iron, and bone. Each ship rivet, each amber bead, each stain in the earth that once was a warrior, is a word in that testament. They tell of a people who stared into the abyss of mortality and responded not with quiet despair, but with roaring pyres, elegies in stone, and ships set sail for the realm of gods. They understood that to be remembered was to achieve a kind of immortality, and they devoted staggering resources to securing it. In our modern world, where death is often hidden and ritual minimized, the brutal, honest, and monumental nature of the Viking funeral challenges us. It forces us to consider what we value enough to consign to the earth, what stories we wish to launch into the future, and how we, too, might build our own mounds not of turf and treasure, but of legacy and meaning to mark the passage of our own voyages from the world of the living.